I have watched this film several times already, and today I concentrated on the beauty of the cinematography. It's not just a beautiful story, but the beautiful way it is told, the angles, the zoom-ins, the zoom-outs. Before we open the floor to comments and questions, Dino has a presentation as a complement to the film about El Vedado, about Havana in general, about El Vedado in particular, and then we'll open the floor to questions and comments.
One of the things that Havana is not the kind of city that people know, as well as someplace like Paris, or New York. It's a medium-sized city. And one of the things that most people don't know is that part of the urban planning traditions and history of all of these cities, pretty much that happened in the middle of the 19th century, beginning first with the famous New York Commissioner's Plan of, I believe it was 1811, which was designed in a hurry to incorporate these 200 by 800 blocks very quickly laid out together to maximize the number of properties one can put in the rest of the island of Manhattan. That was not the principle directing Vedado. Havana, as other cities, has two types of developments, let me call it. And those are the urban interventions in one case, such as the most famous of all being Haussmann, where whole new boulevards were cut into the old medieval Paris and created fabulous vistas with fabulous buildings. Havana had one of those too. It was in old Havana when the walls of the city came down. And it created the most famous area of central Havana, which is the one that most people see it as emulating Paris. The other one is the growth of a city, in other words, an expansion. Some of you may remember the famous Plan Cerdà of Barcelona. There's also the Plan Castro of Madrid. Very similar ideas, in both cases, bringing together the idea of the cuadrícula, the grid, most likely, though, a square block, like Havana. One of those was, in fact, Vedado. But Vedado was unusual in the case that it brought not only bigger blocks, wider streets, but a lot more green than either Barcelona, even Paris or Madrid. And consequently, it stayed in a quasi-suburban look, particularly for most Cubans, people who are more used to the urban density like us New Yorkers here. Okay, so I wanted to show you a little bit of that and highlight it. This was the original plan. Now, where did it grow from? It grew from the extreme end by the exit of the Almendares River into the Gulf of Mexico. That was the last stop of a tram line they call Línea. And Línea became that diagonal line that you see there that went along 9th Street. Became very famous because it was a place of entertainment called El Carmelo. And from there was actually where Vedado grew, not west, but east toward the old city. Here is the model of the city of Havana at the GTIC, the grupo that I am associated with and working with in helping planning and the future of subways, and with the help of a lot of people, some of who are sitting here. Here we have by the time Havana turned the century, the end of 19th century, you see the beginning of the Vedado on the west end, and the old Havana very far off to the east. The city grew with the calzadas radially growing in all directions. But little was happening there. Here's the Columbus Cemetery. There is that famous linea, cutting diagonally. Those are some of the streets that help a city become much more interesting. We have one of those. It is our famous Broadway. If it wasn't for Broadway, the commissioner's plan would be a lot more boring. But with Broadway, we have Madison Square, Union Square, Times Square, Columbus Circle. So there's something to be gained by, quote unquote, the so-called mistakes of urbanism. Here is the famous 1811 plan. Okay? Now, mind you, at that time, they did not even envision a Central Park. Thank God somebody decided to put it. Sorry. Here are other examples. Here is the Plan Castro in Madrid, the old Madrid, the new expansion. Here's the old city of Barcelona, you know, in its own strange hexagonal form with the Plan Cerda beyond. Looking a lot like Paris in a way. Here is the Vedado of that time. Very isolated, you know. And the squares, you know, were being built and created little by little. But it was hilly. And one of the nice things about the Vedado is that it really swept up to reaching almost a level of 150 feet above sea level. So all the breezes coming from the Gulf of Mexico just came right into Vedado. Here are the different neighborhoods that began to be created one after another. And here is, you know, the last almost yet to be connected piece of the Rampa with, by 1930, when the Hotel Nacional was almost finished, and the Rampa was just a big, important line, but with no buildings around it. Part of the problem was that all of this had huge furnias, quarries, holes that were hard to traverse, to fill, and it cost a lot. So it was the last development to unite it to Infanta and the rest of Havana. One of the things that was lost, and in a way, I see it as a sorry problem, is that Vedado did not get the arcades of all Havana. If there's anything that makes Havana very unique, and only comparable to Paris, is the arcades of the city. And not only in the Havana, but much more in central Havana. And you saw that in the film. Here it is, the city, and Vedado inching its way to connect to it. I'll show you a few of the things that you already saw in stills. Here was the famous further construction of the Malecón going west. This was actually the work of the 50s. Originally, the Malecón was built by the American forces, and it was created to open that as a connector going west. It was a very good idea, a good protector also against water invasion. Until then, we had nothing. And this was the continuity of it into the 50s to go all the way to a new sets of tunnels to cross the river and going further west. This is the new image of the city. You know, this was actually a picture from 1957. You know, I left the city in 1954. The Lopez Serrano was it. And I knew it well because I used to go to the clinic right across the street. I refused to eat. Well, I learned the lesson in Spain. But it was famous to me. And then I came back in 1957 and saw this. Really, the city had changed in only 3 years. And this from the air already now shows how the old city to the right has joined Vedado to the left, and everything has closed in. This is Principe Castle, which was the old end of the parade during the colonial times. This is one of the boulevards in fact, this is Paseo, Avenida of the Presidents. Avenue of the Presidents, right. They're both different, okay? They look different. They have different green areas, different sitting areas. This one even incorporates parking. This is an old picture of the old Paseo, look. That at the end was the old sports palace, which was demolished, in fact, when they continued the Malecón west. was a shame. I think it could have been diverted a little bit. This is looking toward the east. And here are this is the new emblem of high-rise, some hotels, the Riviera, the Meliacoiba, and other apartment buildings of sort of, this was two twins. One was built in 1953, I believe, and I saw that go up. Then in 1957, another one was next to it. Something very unusual, very interesting, very open, very different. There's no place like the Vedado, really, that you can look at, almost anywhere. It's high-rise, but it's not dense like our New York or most other cities in the country. One of the things you do see is the absence of parking lots. Well, there are not that many cars right now. I don't know what would have happened. But I say that in a serious tone, though, because if you go to Europe, they can't afford to have parking lots in Paris or Madrid. It's all on the ground, We, on the other hand, well, in New York, that's the exception. But in the rest of the country, I mean, you can go to Kansas City, and half of downtown Kansas City is parking lots, Denver as well. I say that because Patty's not here, the producer. She's from Denver. This is one of my famous images going to that clinic, which is the old Chinese monument to the Chinese who fought in the War of Independence, something that most people in Havana even don't know. And that's the Malecón of today, reaching almost the end. Now, one of the concerns that people have, including our producer, is when you see this view, you say, well, if they keep building high-rise, you're not going to see the ocean. Well, it depends on the angle. I don't think Vedado is yet that dense that this has yet become a problem. But in certain views, like this one, it certainly kind of shows that. Others, no. You still see a lot of the Gulf. This is one of the newer buildings, the Atlantic building, of Cuban vintage, of Cuban architects. And this is Linea. With the reduced divider, it used to have the tram cars for double the size, for 2 lanes. And that's the west end of Vedado, and you see Miramar beyond. One of the problems with that part of Vedado, and it's all this, and one of the problems that we are trying to work out with planning in Havana is that there is a bowl, okay, that happens in it. Got it? Okay. And it's flooding happens often, okay? And it has difficulty for development as well, okay? And this is a favorite view from the top of the Fox building, looking at the city and the Hotel Nacional, and at night. Thank you.
We will now open the floors. We usually take 3 questions at a time at the Bildner, so. Yes, sir?
I don't have a question, but first of all, I'd like to thank you. I'll speak pretty loud. I was a teacher.
Good for you.
I want to thank you for the wonderful film. I'm Cuban by blood, but I was born in Brooklyn.
Okay, well that's perfectly fine.
In 1926, I was fortunate to go there as a little boy in 1940 to see my grandparents, lots of uncles and aunts at the time. And I've been back to Cuba several times. The most interesting time happened when my daughter was interested in the family history. So I went to the New York, I hadn't seen or heard of family in 40 years. I went to the New York Public Library, and I got the 1950s Havana telephone.
Could you?
And I found my family.
Could you shorten your comment because we have many hands?
Finally, I did get to, and the way I found my way to Cuba with my daughter is there was a lecture going on at Cooper Union, and the lecturer was Maguito Cayulo, who I think you know very well.
Yes.
He was the man that helped restore lots of events.
Sir, please, thank you. Yes.
I can speak loud because I was a teacher too.
Can everybody hear?
I haven't. Can you hear me? Okay. I went to school in El Vedado. I went to Colegio Baldor. Is that school still there? Colegio Baldor. Colegio Baldor. Baldor.
Yes, I think so.
Because I didn't see any pictures of.
No. Well,
It was in la calle Línea.
I will reveal something.
Okay.
In fact, this documentary was by force because of limitations of where it was going to be exhibited, limited to 72. As of this particular week, I think PBS may want it in larger. And you may see Valdo.
Okay. La Paloma de Picasso, what happened to it?
Huh?
La Paloma de Picasso was supposed to be put on top of the monument.
You know, that's something I don't know.
It never went up. When the eagle went down, he promised to do. By the way, I also went to Baldor.
Baldor, right?
Yes. From kindergarten to bachillerato. Yes. Any more questions?
You work with them?
Questions, please? Yes.
Yeah, toward the end of the presentation, you briefly showed a photo of the Edificio Atlantic. I, as a journalist, wrote a brief story about it. It was opened in 2007. It was built by an Italian group called Buy and Die Real Estate. It was not a hotel. It was a condominium tower. My question is, what process did it take for a private investor group to be able to build a condo tower in a Malecón? Because, it doesn't happen too often.
Well, frankly, I don't know that. But sitting here with us is Sandra Livingston, who was with me directing the tour group that made this film possible. Okay, Sandy, how are you? Can you answer his question? Okay. Well, he's asking about the potential possibility for development in Havana by foreign investors.
Oh, yes.
Sandra.
Like you.
I'll try to answer it, but I also wanted to say something. I love the documentary. I wanted to say something hopeful, because I think one of the things that was happening only when Patty was making the documentary, and that has gone on a lot more, is that many young artists and young gallerists are taking over and restoring some of the most beautiful, middle-level mansions, not the really gorgeous ones of the 1920s, but some of the middle-class mansions that you mentioned. And I think that's very hopeful for Vedado. In terms of foreign investment, well, first of all, the law in Cuba is that the only people who can own are Cuban-born or permanent residents. And so currently, there are many people who are Cuban-born, but who live in Miami, for example, but who are buying many buildings a través de su familia, through their families, because a Cuban has to be the owner and a current Cuban, okay? Another thing that's happening is that many foreigners, including, Canadians, British, from many countries, are using Cuban substitutes to purchase buildings. I mean, for example, we have been looking at the possibility of putting a branch of the Center for Cuban Studies in Havana. And what has to be done initially, if a buyer is not at least a permanent resident, if not a Cuban, is that a Cuban must purchase the building. For example, some of the buildings we've been looking at, there are 3 different Cuban persons who own the building because it has 3 floors and each floor is owned by a Cuban. So if you want to buy that building, you have to have 3 purchasers still. Anyway, it's complicated, right? Sorry.
Sandra. Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Thanks.
Elba?
Yeah, I have a question. The colors of the buildings, have they restored the same colors of the buildings that were originally? Those greens
Not always.
and vibrant colors
Not
that are
always.
so beautiful?
Not always, because by and large, if the group that's developing it or renewing it at a particular time, okay, if they're able to get the paint colors to match, they do so. At other times, when there's scarcity, it happens right and left. Then, and I know a story that Eusebio told me. Basically, one building, he just couldn't believe that it was being painted green. And basically the guy said, I was told to paint it, and the only paint I have is green, if that answers your question. But, it's better painted because at least the building can continue to be rescued and supported. Without paint, a lot of the structures in Havana, Old Havana, Central Havana, even in the Vedado, have suffered greatly, and some of them are irreparable. I mean, they cannot be brought back.
Were they as vibrant colors as they are now?
The vibrant colors, they used to not be as vibrant in my time, okay, in the early 50s. They were more subdued, they were more pastels, but, over time, tastes change, I think, and that's happened. By the time I believe that when I first saw the Foxa being built in 1957 with all these contrasting colors, wow, it was just something new. And then the Retiro Médico by Antonio Quintana came in with all the balconies a different color. So it's really multicolored, and it was spectacular. Unfortunately, also, it's lost all the colors now. So, it's in the process of rehabilitation. I always say something that doesn't sound right, but, if you have your building and you own it, you maintain it. If the owner is absent, who maintains it? And that's a problem that we have experienced in many, many cases, that it's very hard to repair a building unless you're constantly there tending to it. I mean, aside from not having enough funds or not having enough materials, that's a whole other set of problems, okay? And we try the best because we want to save the city.
What I, go ahead.
My fear is Miami, another place, because as it is now, as bad as things are there, at least there was no construction. Like Trump said one time, I love Havana. You know why he loves Havana? He wants to build buildings.
Yeah.
And they will just destroy the city. So,
well, there certainly is that fear, and there certainly are those who have that mentality that that's what they would want to do. However, I would caution you to think only that way, because the fact is that a lot of people, even especially in Cuba, have seen the damage of rapid development and urbanization that has been done carelessly to many cities, including Miami, that even people in Miami, like me, I'm a Miami Beach resident, I don't like. Yeah. And we're going to not push it. On the contrary, we're going to hold it back.
We had
a little optimism.
We had some questions from this side. Yes?
I was just saying,
El micrófono.
I guess I was saying the Vedado.
Yeah.
But I didn't know it. And what I found interesting when I was walking down the Malecón, there's no high-rises there, which I found strange. Why isn't there high-rises? Their high-rises are about a quarter of a mile back.
Where? In what part?
In the Malecón area.
Where in Malecón?
I don't know. It was by the hospital. There's a big hospital there. Right. I don't know I don't know.
You can throw me back into history that I know very, very well. Because the fact was that a lot of the property owners along Malecón, especially where I used to live, which is in central Havana, all the way to the Punta Castle, people who owned their own homes right on Malecón, they didn't want to get rid of them. So it stayed with 2- and 3-story buildings forever until they collapsed.
But they're collapsing.
Yeah, only in a very few cases. And I remember when I was probably around 10, and there was an Atlantic Hotel being built, and I looked at it. It was like 6, 7 floors tall. Wow, that broke that. Then came into Deauville in the 50s. That was like 16 stories tall. There's very few of those. And then the cajon, the ataúd, the one closest to the punta, because it looks like coffins, all piled up. That's like an 18-story building, and everybody stares at it, okay? But there are very few in that whole area of Malecón. However, on the Vedado side, there's more. You should see the new hotels that are being built right now that are not here yet, because this is a three-year-old film. 20 stories, 3 of them. Bam, bam, bam. Okay?
You want to sell it,
huh?
The people that had those buildings that
well, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that some of them were clubs, and the clubs remain, and they wanted to preserve it, and that's been happening, Okay,
thank you.
Any more questions?
Yeah, with the murals or the mosaics on the Hotel Nacional, Amelia Pala's mural.
It's gone. It's gone.
They've gone forever?
It's been removed.
They've been removed
completely.
Forever? Oh, this doesn't work.
It's been destroyed.
Is there a reason?
I don't know the reason. Now, it may have been that to replace all the little mosaics that kept on falling became either a headache, an expense, or they simply couldn't even find the colors, of the mosaics to supplant them when they broke. That they did that this past year. It's all removed. It's a blank cement wall now.
So is there anything in place to prevent?
Well, I don't know. I haven't heard any news.
There was in the film, the federal land mural made out of mosaic.
Well, you're talking now of the Retiro Médico.
Right.
Yeah, those interior ones have been saved. Well, the elements haven't destroyed them. Huh?
Is there anything in place to prevent the destruction of those murals?
It's like anything. If people take care of things and preserve them, they stay. If there's no one to take care of them, they fall apart. And I mean, especially the mosaics of Amelia Pelaez, realize it was an external, it was on a western face. It was huge. I mean, you're looking at a block that was 360 feet at that location by like 60 foot tall. That's how big that thing was. Well, they start falling, you go crazy. I mean, I'm not defending them. It's a great shame that the work of Amelia Pelaez is gone. But it's the way it is.
Hi. Every time I go to Cuba and I visit the Tropicana, and I look at the beautiful...
I bet you would.
the beautiful statues outside that were at one time at another place, they seem to be glazed over with some kind of stucco that takes away from the beauty of the original marble. And I'm always wondering, why is that done?
I fail to know the answer simply because I don't live there. So I can't keep up, on all the information. For all I know, they may be resorting to things like that as a means of preserving.
Yeah, it preserves, but it also depreciates the beauty.
It really takes a lot of money and effort and artisans to keep a city like this going. Let's face it, what you just saw today, you have a hard time finding that openly in New York. And New York's the biggest place on earth.
Isn't Havana a UN heritage city protected by the UN?
No. Only Old Havana.
Old Havana. Not
and only Old Havana because they saw the potential of what happens when you renovate and restore an old city like that.
So that can't be...
I mean, we have buildings there from the 16th century.
Yeah,
They're
I know.
from 1500s.
It's amazing. I'm going again in November, and I'm going to...
In fact, I often tell people, if you don't know, in fact, I saw a documentary recently that spoke about the Spanish heritage in America. Well, the fact is that in St. Augustine precedes the first English settlement by almost a century.
I know. Right?
And Havana is even older. In fact, it's celebrating 500 years today.
I'll be there.
It's and it was big when 1820 came along. That year, that decade, 1820 to 1830, is when New York City became bigger than Havana in size and population. But the incredible numbers of immigrants that were just pouring through our harbor into the city is what forced the commissioner's plan to existence. Because we had to build so fast, unfortunately poorer, because the end result was that a lot of our building was not that good, okay? You know, you're looking at pictures of Vedado, how that was built. My God, look at the pictures of just the average, you know, side street in New York, you know, from the 20s all the way up to the 90s. And they're not that good because they were built in a hurry. I mean, some were, you know, they took special care. They're more beautiful, especially on Riverside Drive, but not everywhere. On Fifth Avenue, yes, but not, you know, not on West 87th Street, you know. I hope nobody lives there. Yes.
We had a wonderful Chinese community in Havana.
Yes, you did. Yes, we did.
Beautiful place.
Yes. 40,000 strong.
That's right. They were wonderful.
Yes.
El Teatro Shanghai was right.
That biggest next to San Francisco.
Right. And the last thing I want to ask you, there was a cemetery for Chinese behind the Colón Cemetery. Is that true?
Yes, it's still there.
Still there.
You bet. Now, one of the things about cemeteries, it's a pet peeve of mine. And we're coming now in America to understand the meaning of green cemeteries. Well, that cemetery, Columbus Cemetery, is one of the biggest green cemeteries in the world because, and my family's buried there. In that one pantheon of theirs, which has 2 gravesites with a depth of about 10 feet, we can bury as many as 5 on each side. Over the period of 3 years, with the heat of the sun there, and the line with which the top is cast in there, all that's found is pure bones. The bones are then removed after 3 years and put into a little box, no bigger than this, and then put in the osario, which is behind the 2 graves, you know. And I have about 28 people buried in that one.
What happened to the old ceiba trees and the old majestic trees that were in Vedado? The vegetation, the trees.
Well, the trees are there. The problem is that from time to time, you know, when you have a very bad hurricane, okay, or bad storms, and mind you, we're getting more frequency of them there as well as we are getting them here, okay? A lot is suffering. In fact, one of the things that I'm most upset about is that I remember the old Prado that had these huge trees all the way to the Punta Castle. Guess what? The first 2-3 blocks now, all the trees are almost gone. And they're gone from the wind coming from the northwest that hits the Prado directly. Any more questions? As you can see, it's one of my favorite subjects.
Viva El Vedado.
Thank you for coming. Hi.